The man I was told to fear my entire life looked me straight in the eyes and said 5 words that shattered everything I thought I knew. "I'm your real father, Viola." I stood there in his doorway, frozen, my whole body trembling. For 25 years, my parents warned me about this man. They called him dangerous, unstable, a monster. But standing in that quiet living room with its neat bookshelves and the smell of fresh coffee, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The monsters were never across the street. They were sitting at my dinner table every single night. But let me back up, because you need to understand how a 32-year-old woman ends up standing in a stranger's house, discovering her entire life was built on lies. My name is Viola Brennan, or at least, that's what I thought my name was. I'm 32 years old and I work as an accountant at a mid-size firm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You know the type of job. Decent salary, fluorescent lights, and a coffee machine that sounds like it's dying a slow, painful death every time someone uses it. I've been there for 8 years, which in accountant years is basically a life sentence with good behavior. I grew up in a nice house on Maple Ridge Drive. White fence, green lawn, the whole American dream package. My parents, Jose and Constancia Brennan, were respected in our community. My father worked in insurance for 30 years. My mother was a homemaker who volunteered at church functions and always brought the best casserole to neighborhood potlucks. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. From the inside, it was a different story entirely. I have 2 siblings. My older brother, Wesley, who's 35 and has somehow managed to fail upward his entire life. The man has had 6 different business ventures, all funded by our parents, and all spectacular failures. But does anyone call him irresponsible? Of course not. Wesley is the golden child. Wesley can do no wrong. Wesley once crashed my father's car into a mailbox while texting, and my mother blamed the mailbox for being in the wrong place. That mailbox had been standing there for 15 years, but apparently it chose that exact moment to jump in front of Wesley's car. Then there's my younger sister, Nadia, 28, who decided that finding herself required visiting every country in Europe on our parents' dime. She sends postcards from Barcelona and Florence, while I'm the one driving our mother to her doctor's appointments and picking up our father's prescriptions. And then there's me, the middle child, the invisible one, the one who does everything and gets nothing. I used to think I was just unlucky. Some families have a favorite child, and I simply wasn't it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that being responsible was its own reward. I told myself a lot of things to help me sleep at night, but there was always this feeling I couldn't shake, this sense that something was fundamentally wrong. My mother looked at Wesley and Nadia with warmth and pride. When she looked at me, there was something else in her eyes, something guarded, almost like fear. I remember being 7 years old when the man moved into the house across the street, Theodore Ashford, a quiet man with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes. He kept to himself, maintained his yard, and never bothered anyone. But the moment he arrived, my parents sat me down for a very serious conversation. They told me Theodore Ashford was dangerous. They said he had done terrible things. They said I should never, under any circumstances, speak to him or go near his house. If he ever approached me, I was to run home immediately and tell them. My father's face was stern. My mother's hands were shaking. I was 7. I believed them completely. For 25 years, I crossed to the other side of the street whenever I passed his house. I avoided eye contact. I warned friends who came to visit. The monster across the street became part of my childhood mythology, like the boogeyman or the thing hiding under my bed. But monsters under beds aren't real. And as I would soon discover, neither was the story my parents told me. It started 3 months ago on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are when I do my parents' grocery shopping. Yes, at 32 years old, I'm still doing my parents' grocery shopping. My therapist calls it codependency. I call it being the only child who actually shows up. I arrived at my parents' house with 4 bags of groceries, including the specific brand of oatmeal my father insists on and the particular type of yogurt my mother requires. I'm basically a personal shopper who doesn't get paid, or thanked, or acknowledged. If martyrdom came with a loyalty card, I'd have earned a free vacation by now. My mother wasn't in the kitchen. which was unusual. I heard voices upstairs, so I put away the groceries and went up to see if she needed help with anything. The voices were coming from my father's office, a room I was never really allowed to enter as a child. The door was slightly open. I heard my mother's voice first, tight and anxious, then Wesley's voice, calm and reassuring. They were talking about the house, about transferring the deed, about making sure everything was in Wesley's name before, and then my mother said something that stopped me cold. She said they needed to do it now, before Viola starts asking questions. I stood there in that hallway, grocery store loyalty card still in my hand, and felt something crack inside my chest. Before Viola starts asking questions. What questions? What were they hiding? I should have confronted them right then, but I didn't. Instead, I quietly went back downstairs, finished putting away the groceries, and told my mother I had to leave early for a work meeting. She barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning those words over in my mind. Before Viola starts asking questions, I started thinking about all the little things that never added up. Why I looked nothing like my siblings, why my mother kept my baby photos in a separate album, tucked away in the attic instead of displayed on the mantle with Wesley's and Nadia's. Why, when I asked about my birth story, my mother always changed the subject. I'm an accountant. I notice when numbers don't add up. And suddenly, I realized the numbers of my life had never added up at all. A week later, I volunteered to help clean out the attic. My mother was hesitant, but I insisted. Just trying to be helpful, Mom. Just trying to be a good daughter. The same performance I'd been giving for 32 years. I found the photo in an old shoebox buried under Christmas decorations from the 1980s. It was a Polaroid, faded but still clear. My mother, young and beautiful, standing next to a man. They were holding hands. She was looking at him with an expression I had never seen her direct at my father, and she was visibly pregnant. The man in the photo was Theodore Ashford, the monster across the street. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I turned the photo over. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 2 words and a date, our miracle, and a date that was exactly 9 months before my birthday. I shoved the photo in my pocket and climbed down from the attic. My mother asked if I found anything interesting up there. I smiled and said, just old Christmas ornaments. I learned that smile from her, the one that hides everything. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment. Thank you. I waited 3 days before confronting my mother. 3 days of lying awake at night, staring at that photograph, trying to find any explanation other than the obvious one. Maybe it was her brother. Maybe it was a cousin. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent reason my very pregnant mother was holding hands with the neighborhood monster and calling him our miracle. But accountants don't believe in maybes. We believe in documentation. And that photo was documentation of something my family had been hiding for over 3 decades. I chose my moment carefully. A Sunday afternoon when my father was napping and Wesley wasn't around to interfere. I found my mother in the kitchen doing what she always did, preparing food for people who never appreciated it. Just like me, actually. Maybe that was the one thing we had in common. I placed the photograph on the counter next to her cutting board. I didn't say anything. I just watched her face. The color drained from her cheeks so fast I thought she might faint. Her knife clattered against the counter. She stared at that photo like it was a snake that had just slithered into her kitchen. When she finally looked up at me, I saw something I'd never seen before in my mother's eyes. Pure, undiluted panic. She tried to explain. She stumbled over words, contradicted herself, changed her story 3 times in 2 minutes. First, Theodore was just an old friend. Then he was a coworker of my father's. Then she claimed she didn't even remember taking that photo, that it must have been some kind of joke. I asked her one simple question. Is Theodore Ashford my biological father? That's when panic turned to anger. My mother's face hardened into something ugly. She told me I was being ridiculous. She told me I was stirring up old dirt that should stay buried. She told me that if I continued down this path, I would be cut out of this family completely. Cut out, like I was ever really included in the first place. I asked about the house transfer, about why she and my father were secretly putting everything in Wesley's name. Her face went from angry to absolutely furious. She demanded to know if I'd been spying on them. She accused me of being ungrateful after everything they had done for me. Everything they had done for me. I wanted to laugh. What had they done for me exactly? Provided the bare minimum of food and shelter while lavishing attention and money on my siblings? Made me feel like a guest in my own home for 32 years? Lied to me about my own identity? But I didn't laugh. I didn't cry either, even though part of me wanted to. I just picked up the photograph and walked out. That night, my father called me. His voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. He told me my mother was very upset. He told me I needed to apologize and forget about whatever nonsense I'd gotten into my head. He told me that Theodore Ashford was a dangerous man who had stalked my mother years ago, and that bringing up his name was causing her genuine distress. When I asked why Theodore had stalked her, my father said it wasn't my business. When I asked why they had never called the police, he said they had handled it privately. When I asked why Theodore would move across the street from the woman he allegedly stalked, my father hung up on me. The next few weeks were a masterclass in family gaslighting. Suddenly, everyone was concerned about poor, confused Viola. Wesley called to suggest I might be having a breakdown from work stress. He used his fake sympathetic voice, the one he pulls out when he wants something. He said I should really think about seeing a professional before I embarrassed myself further. Nadia sent a long text from wherever she was in Europe this time, all about how family is family and sometimes we have to let go of the past. Easy to say when you're sipping wine in a Tuscan vineyard on someone else's credit card. Even my fiancé Jace started acting strange. Jace Edwards, the man I'd been with for 3 years, the man I thought I was going to marry. He sat me down one evening and told me my family was worried about me. He said I was becoming obsessed with something that probably meant nothing. He said I was embarrassing everyone with my conspiracy theories. Funny thing about Jace, he'd been trying to get my father to invest in his real estate development company for over a year. My father kept saying he'd think about it, and now suddenly, Jace was very interested in keeping the Brennan family happy. What a remarkable coincidence. His concern for my mental health arrived at the exact same time as his need for their money. I'm sure those two things were completely unrelated. I looked at this man I thought I loved and realized I didn't know him at all, just like I didn't know my family, just like I apparently didn't know myself. I started doing research, quietly, carefully. I pulled my own birth certificate from the county records office. The original had been amended when I was 2 years old. Amended. Not issued at birth. Amended. The original father's name was blacked out, replaced with Jose Brennan. Who amends a birth certificate 2 years after a child is born? I'll tell you who. Someone with something to hide. I searched for any public records about Theodore Ashford. If he was really a dangerous stalker, there should be something. A restraining order, an arrest record, a news article, something. What I found was the opposite. Theodore Ashford was a retired professor of literature from the local community college. He had taught there for 30 years before retiring with honors. He volunteered at the public library twice a week. He had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. The only thing I found connecting him to my family was a brief mention in a police blotter from 25 years ago. Constancia Brennan had filed a harassment complaint against Theodore Ashford. The case was closed 3 months later due to insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence, the same words that kept echoing in my head about everything my parents had ever told me. I started paying closer attention to Theodore, watching him from my old bedroom window at my parents' house. He tended his garden every morning. He collected his mail at the same time every afternoon. Sometimes he would stand on his porch in the evening, looking across the street at my parents' house with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it longing? Was it regret? Was it something else entirely? One afternoon, I noticed him watching as I helped my mother bring groceries inside. Our eyes met for just a moment. And in that moment, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. He recognized me. Not like a neighbor recognizes someone who's lived across the street for years. He recognized me the way you recognize someone you love, someone you've lost, someone you've been waiting to see again. Then my mother called my name sharply, and I looked away. When I looked back, Theodore had gone inside. The next week, I received something in the mail that changed everything. No return address, my name handwritten in careful, elegant script. Inside was a DNA testing kit and a single note on plain white paper. The truth is waiting when you're ready. I stared at that note for hours. The handwriting didn't match my mother's or father's. It wasn't Wesley's messy scrawl or Nadia's loopy cursive, but someone knew. Someone wanted me to know. Someone had been waiting for me to start asking the right questions. I took the test that night. I sealed the envelope, walked to a mailbox 3 blocks away so no one would see me, and sent it off to the laboratory. Then I went home to my apartment, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited for my entire life to fall apart. Or maybe, finally, to make sense. The results came back on a Thursday. I know because I had been checking my email every hour for 8 days straight. My coworkers probably thought I was waiting for some kind of medical diagnosis. In a way, I suppose I was. I opened the email in my car during lunch break. I couldn't risk looking at it inside the office. If I was going to have a breakdown, I wanted to do it in private, like a civilized person. The results were very clear, very scientific, very devastating. Jose and Constancia Brennan were not my biological parents. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes just staring at the screen. Part of me had known, of course. Part of me had suspected since the moment I found that photograph, but seeing it in writing, in official laboratory documentation, was something else entirely. I wasn't their daughter. I never had been. The test also showed something else. A DNA match to an unknown male relative. A very close match. Parent-child close. Theodore Ashford wasn't just my mother's old friend or some random stalker. He was my father. My real father, and he had been living across the street watching me grow up for 25 years. I thought about driving straight to his house and demanding answers, but I stopped myself. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the people who had lied to me, who had stolen my identity, who had turned a quiet professor into a monster in my mind for their own purposes. If I was going to confront this, I needed to do it smart. I needed to be prepared. Over the next few weeks, I became a detective in my own life. Accountants are good at finding things that don't add up, and my life had more red flags than a bullfighting convention. I started with Theodore, not approaching him, not yet, just research. I found his faculty page on the college's archived website. He had a doctorate in English literature. He had published 2 books on American poetry. His student reviews called him brilliant, kind, patient. Dangerous criminals don't typically get described as patient by 19-year-olds who had to read Walt Whitman at 8 in the morning. I found the original police report from the harassment complaint. My mother claimed Theodore had been following her, watching her house, trying to contact her through letters and phone calls. Theodore denied all charges. The case was dismissed when my mother suddenly withdrew her complaint, citing personal reasons. What kind of personal reasons make you drop a harassment case against someone you later call a monster? Then I found something that made me sick to my stomach, a financial record buried in public court filings. Theodore Ashford had created a trust fund in 1993 for a minor child named Viola Ashford. The initial deposit was $50,000, money from his late mother's estate. Over the years, he had added to it. By the time I turned 18, it should have contained over $180,000. Should have. Because when I searched for the current status of that trust, I found that it had been accessed and drained. The listed guardian who authorized the withdrawals was Constancia Brennan. My mother had stolen my inheritance. My real inheritance from my real father meant for me. She had taken every penny and never said a word. That night, I dug into my parents' finances. I'm an accountant. I know how to follow money, and what I found made the trust fund theft look like pocket change. My parents had been claiming me as a disabled dependent on their taxes for over a decade. They had been collecting Social Security benefits in my name, benefits I had never seen. They had opened credit cards using my Social Security number and run up debts that were technically in my name. My family hadn't just lied to me about who I was. They had been financially exploiting me since I was a child. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, surrounded by printouts and financial records, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Pure. clarifying anger. Not the helpless frustration I usually felt after family dinners. Not the quiet resentment that simmered every time Wesley got praised for breathing. This was different. This was powerful. They had stolen my father. They had stolen my money. They had stolen my identity. And they had done it while making me feel like I was the one who didn't belong. No more. I made a decision. I would approach Theodore, but not as myself, not as the suspicious daughter coming to demand answers. I would go to him as a lost, naive young woman who had stumbled onto some confusing information. I would play dumb, because underestimating me was what my family had always done best. If Theodore was really the monster my parents claimed, I would know soon enough. And if he wasn't, well, then the real monsters were about to discover that the child they had abused for 32 years was finally ready to fight back. The next Saturday morning, I put on my most innocent-looking outfit, a soft blue sweater, minimal makeup, my hair down instead of in its usual practical ponytail. I practiced looking confused and vulnerable in the mirror. It wasn't hard. I'd spent most of my life feeling that way. I walked across the street to Theodore Ashford's house. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every step felt like walking through water. 25 years of fear doesn't disappear just because you've done some research. His yard was immaculate. Roses along the walkway, a welcome mat that actually said welcome, not exactly the lair of a monster. I rang the doorbell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps. The door opened. Theodore Ashford stood there. Older than in my mother's photograph, but still recognizable. Gray hair now fully silver. Kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a cardigan, for goodness sake. The man looked like he should be hosting a public television show about butterflies. He stared at me for a long moment. And then I watched as recognition flooded his face, followed by something that looked like grief, followed by something that looked like hope. He said my name, not a question, a statement. Viola. And then, before I could even begin my rehearsed story about being confused and needing help, he said the words that brought me to this moment. I'm your real father, Viola, and I've been waiting 25 years for you to knock on this door. So much for playing dumb. Theodore invited me inside with hands that trembled slightly. I noticed he had to steady himself against the doorframe. This man had waited a quarter century for this moment. I couldn't imagine carrying that kind of hope for so long. His living room was exactly what you'd expect from a retired literature professor. Books everywhere, not arranged for show, but clearly read and loved. Comfortable furniture that had seen better days, photos on the mantle of people I didn't recognize, and one photo, just one, slightly hidden behind the others, a baby picture, me. I recognized it because my mother had the same one in that hidden album in the attic. Theodore offered me tea, then coffee, then water. He was so nervous, he could barely complete a sentence. Finally, I told him to sit down before he wore a hole in his carpet. He laughed, this surprised, grateful sound, and I realized it was probably the first time in years someone had spoken to him like a normal person instead of a pariah. Over the next 3 hours, he told me everything. He and my mother had met at a bookstore in 1991. She was 23, working as a secretary, engaged to Jose Brennan. Theodore was 30, already teaching at the college. They had reached for the same book of poetry at the same moment, and somehow that small coincidence had turned into coffee, then dinner, then something neither of them had planned. Constancia was not happy in her engagement. Jose was stable, came from money, was approved by her family, but there was no passion there, no connection. With Theodore, she found something different, something real. Their relationship lasted 4 months. Then Constancia discovered she was pregnant. Theodore wanted to marry her. He wanted to raise the child together. He begged her to leave Jose, promised he would take care of her, promised they could build a life together. But Constancia made a different choice. Jose had money. Jose had family connections. Jose had a future that looked impressive on paper. Theodore was a young professor with student loans and a small apartment. In Constancia's calculation, security won over love. She broke off the relationship immediately. She married Jose 3 weeks later, before she was showing. She never told him the baby wasn't his. Jose believed Viola was premature when she was born full term. Nobody questioned the math. When I was born, Theodore tried to be part of my life. He sent letters to Constancia, asking for photos, asking to see me. He opened the trust fund in my name, depositing his inheritance so I would be provided for. He was desperate to have some connection to his daughter, even if he couldn't be her father publicly. Constancia's response was to file a harassment complaint. She told the police Theodore was stalking her, sending unwanted letters, watching her house. She told Jose, and Jose threatened to ruin Theodore's career if he didn't stay away. Theodore was given a choice: disappear from my life completely and keep his job, his reputation, everything he had built, or fight for his parental rights and lose everything. He made the choice he thought was best for me. He stayed away. He kept his distance. He stopped sending letters, but he couldn't stop watching. When the house across the street went up for sale 5 years later, Theodore bought it. Not to stalk, not to harass, just to be close, just to watch his daughter grow up, even if she never knew who he was, just to make sure she was okay. All those years he had been there. Every birthday, every first day of school, every milestone I had. He watched from his window. He kept a journal of everything he saw. He never stopped loving a daughter who had been taught to fear him. I asked him about the trust fund. His face darkened. He had set it up with Constancia listed as guardian, believing she would use it for my education, my future. Instead, she had forged documents, claimed I was mentally incapacitated, and drained every penny for herself. When Theodore discovered what she had done, he had tried to pursue legal action. But by then, the money was gone, spent on Wesley's failed businesses and Nadia's European adventures. The lawyers told him it would cost more to fight than he would ever recover. So he did the only thing he could. He kept watching, he kept waiting, and he kept hoping that someday his daughter would find her way to the truth. Then I asked about the DNA kit, the one that arrived anonymously at my apartment. Theodore's eyes filled with tears. He admitted it was him. He had been watching for years, waiting for any sign that I was questioning things. When he saw me find the photograph in the attic through my old bedroom window, when he saw the way I looked at it before hiding it in my pocket, he knew. He knew I was ready. He said he'd bought that DNA kit 3 years ago. He'd been carrying it in his desk drawer, waiting for the right moment. When he saw me searching, he finally had the courage to send it. He apologized for not being braver, for not finding another way, for every birthday he missed, every scraped knee he couldn't bandage, every achievement he couldn't celebrate. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. The villains of this story were not across the street. They were in the house I had called home for 32 years. He showed me the documentation. Box after box of letters he had written and never sent. Birthday cards for every year of my life. Carefully stored, never delivered. Legal correspondence about the trust fund, the original birth certificate listing Theodore Ashford as father, before Constancia had it amended. I had come to this house planning to play naive. Instead, I found myself crying for the first time in months, not sad tears, something else, relief maybe, or grief for all the lost years, or just the overwhelming feeling of finally being seen. Theodore held my hand, this man I had feared my whole life, and apologized again. I told him to stop apologizing. We had work to do. We made a plan that day. Not a revenge plan, not exactly. A justice plan. Theodore had documentation of the trust fund theft. I had evidence of the identity fraud, the tax evasion, the Social Security scam. Together, we had enough to bring down the entire house of cards my parents had built their comfortable life upon. But we had to be smart. We had to be careful. Constancia had spent decades manipulating everyone around her. She would not go down without a fight. I returned home that night and did something that required every ounce of acting ability I possessed. I apologized to my mother. I told her I had been stressed, confused, that I had let my imagination run wild. I told her I was ready to be a good daughter again. Constancia accepted my apology with gracious condescension. Of course she forgave me. She understood that I was going through a difficult time. She even hugged me, this woman who had stolen my father, my money, my identity. I hugged her back and smiled, because while she was patting herself on the back for bringing her wayward daughter back into line, I was mentally cataloging every document I would need to access, every file cabinet I would need to photograph, every piece of evidence I would need to build an airtight case. Over the next month, I became the perfect daughter. I helped with groceries, I attended family dinners, I laughed at my father's jokes and complimented my mother's cooking. I even pretended to reconcile with Jace, letting him believe I had come to my senses, all while secretly meeting with Theodore every week, all while photographing documents when my parents weren't looking, all while building a case that would destroy everything they had built on my suffering. I found the folder 2 weeks before we planned to take action. It was in my mother's filing cabinet behind old tax returns and utility bills, a folder labeled VA Settlement. VA Viola Ashford, my real name, the name on my original birth certificate, the name I should have grown up with. Inside was everything. The original trust fund documents, Theodore's letters, the ones Constantia claimed never existed, legal papers showing she had declared me mentally incompetent to access my own money, bank statements showing exactly where every dollar had gone, and at the very bottom, a letter from Theodore to Constantia, dated 15 years ago. He begged her to let him see me, just once. He promised he would disappear forever if she would just let him say goodbye to his daughter. Her response was written in the margin, in her own handwriting. Never. She's mine now. You'll never get her back. I took photos of everything. Then I carefully replaced the folder exactly as I had found it. My mother was calling from the kitchen, asking if I wanted to stay for dinner. I said yes, of course. I would love to stay for dinner. After all, it would be one of the last family dinners we would ever have. If you're still with me, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying this story, a quick really does help more than you know. It helps other people find these stories too. Okay, now let me tell you what happened next. The invitation went out 3 weeks before the party, Jose and Constancia Brennan's 32nd wedding anniversary celebration. All friends and family welcome. Catered dinner, live music, speeches from the children. My mother was thrilled when I suggested it. She had always wanted a big anniversary party, the kind where everyone could see how perfect her life was, how successful her husband was, how devoted her children were, how blessed she was. I told her I wanted to plan the whole thing, a gift from me to them, to make up for my recent behavior. She accepted with tears in her eyes, this woman who had stolen everything from me, genuinely moved by my apparent devotion. If I wasn't so angry, I might have admired her ability to believe her own lies. The planning took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of coordinating with caterers and musicians. 3 weeks of sending invitations to every person who mattered in my parents' social circle, their neighbors, their church friends, my father's former colleagues, my mother's book club, the extended family who had watched me grow up believing I was the difficult middle child. Theodore and I met every evening during those 3 weeks, refining our strategy. He had hired a forensic accountant to document the trust fund theft. I had compiled evidence of the identity fraud and Social Security scam. Together, we had enough to bring criminal charges. But charges alone weren't enough. My mother had spent 32 years building her reputation as a pillar of the community. I wanted that reputation destroyed, along with everything else. I wanted everyone to see who she really was. Theodore tried to talk me out of the public confrontation. He said the legal process would be enough. He said we didn't need to humiliate them in front of everyone they knew. He said revenge wasn't worth becoming someone I wasn't. I reminded him that he had watched his daughter grow up from across the street for 25 years because of what this woman had done. I reminded him that she had stolen his mother's inheritance, money meant for the grandchild Eleanor never got to meet. I reminded him that my entire childhood had been a lie, constructed to benefit people who never loved me. He didn't argue after that. The night of the party, I arrived early to oversee the setup. The backyard looked beautiful. White tents, string lights, flowers everywhere. My mother had insisted on a specific color scheme, blush pink and gold, because those were the colors of her original wedding. Everything had to be perfect for the perfect family, celebrating their perfect life. I caught myself arranging centerpieces and had to laugh. Here I was, planning the most elaborate family takedown in Maple Ridge Drive history, and I was still worried about whether the flower arrangements were symmetrical. Old habits die hard, I suppose. 32 years of being the responsible daughter doesn't just disappear overnight. Guests started arriving at 6. By 7, the backyard was full. 50 people, maybe more, all dressed in their Sunday best, all ready to toast 32 years of marital bliss. Wesley arrived with his wife, a quiet woman named Sandra who always looked slightly terrified. I had never really talked to her, but I suspected she knew more about our family's dysfunction than she let on. She avoided my mother like you avoid a rattlesnake you've spotted in the grass. Smart woman. I was starting to think she was the only one in this family with any survival instincts. Nadia had actually flown in from Portugal for the occasion. My mother was beside herself with joy. Her youngest daughter, home at last. Never mind that Nadia was home because I had secretly paid for her flight, telling her there was something important she needed to see. And then there was Jace, my fiancé, looking handsome in a new suit, already deep in conversation with Wesley about some investment opportunity. He had been particularly attentive lately, probably because he sensed the tide turning in his favor with my parents. If he played his cards right, he might finally get that investment from my father. I watched him laughing with my brother, two men bonding over their shared interest in my family's money, and felt absolutely nothing. Whatever love I had once felt for Jace Edwards had been replaced by something cold and hard, like a number that doesn't balance, like a column of figures that will never add up no matter how many times you check them. At 8 o'clock, dinner was served. At 9, the speeches began. Wesley went first, delivering a toast so generic it could have been copied from a greeting card. He talked about what wonderful parents Jose and Constancia were, how they had always supported their children, how they had built a home filled with love. I watched my mother dab at her eyes with a handkerchief and wondered if she even remembered what love actually looked like. Nadia went next, her speech short and sweet, talking about gratitude and family bonds and all the adventures her parents had made possible. She didn't mention that those adventures were funded by money stolen from her sister. She didn't know that yet. She would soon. Then it was my turn. I walked to the small stage we had set up, microphone in hand, heart pounding, but hands steady. 50 faces looked up at me, expecting another generic toast about wonderful parents and blessed childhoods. I smiled at my mother. She smiled back, already composing her humble acceptance of my praise. I began by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate this special occasion. I talked about how meaningful family was, how important it was to know where you came from, who your people were, how the truth always matters, even when it's difficult. I saw my mother's smile falter slightly. My father shifted in his seat. Then I said I had a special gift for my parents, a video I had put together documenting their journey as a family. I asked the tech guy to play it on the large screen we had set up. The first image was my mother's photograph with Theodore, young Constantia, pregnant, holding hands with a man who was not her husband. The date was visible in the corner. The murmuring started immediately. The next images were documents. The original birth certificate listing Theodore Ashford as my father, the amended certificate with Jose's name, legal papers showing my mother had declared me mentally incompetent to access a trust fund I never knew existed. My mother was standing now, her face the color of chalk. She was saying something, but the microphone wasn't near her. All 50 guests could see was a woman who looked like she was about to be sick. I continued narrating over the slideshow. I explained about the trust fund, $180,000 stolen from a child by the woman who was supposed to protect her. I explained about the Social Security fraud, the identity theft, the decades of financial exploitation. I told them about Theodore Ashford, the man across the street, the man they had all been warned about, the man who was actually my father, who had been kept from his daughter through lies and legal manipulation. And then I played the recording. I had made it 3 days earlier, hidden microphone in my purse during one of my helpful daughter visits. My mother's voice, clear as day, laughing about how easy it had been to drain Theodore's trust fund. My father's voice, joking that the fool had basically funded their retirement. Wesley's voice, explaining how he had forged the documents to make it look legal. The backyard was silent, completely, utterly silent. I looked at my mother. She was crying now, but not the delicate tears she used for sympathy. These were ugly tears, the kind that come when you realize everything is falling apart. I looked at my father. He was staring at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I looked at Wesley. He was already backing toward the gate, probably calculating how quickly he could get to his car. And then I delivered my final gift. Red and blue lights appeared at the end of the driveway. 2 police cars, right on schedule. Theodore had filed criminal charges the week before, armed with all the evidence we'd gathered. The warrants had been issued that morning. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward the gate, toward the officers who were now entering the backyard. Behind me, I heard my mother screaming. I heard my father trying to calm her down. I heard Wesley's wife, Sandra, saying something that sounded like, "I knew it. I always knew it." But I didn't turn around. I had spent 32 years looking back, trying to understand why my family treated me the way they did. Now I finally had my answer, and I was done looking back. The arrests happened quickly. The officers were professional, efficient, clearly prepared for the possibility of resistance. My mother tried to resist, of course. She tried to explain, to justify, to blame everyone except herself. Theodore had manipulated me. I was mentally unstable. This was all a misunderstanding. The officers weren't interested in her explanations. They had warrants. They had evidence. They had a job to do. Jose Brennan was arrested for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Constancia Brennan faced the same charges, plus additional counts related to the trust fund theft. Wesley Brennan, who had tried to slip away during the chaos, was caught at the garden gate and arrested for his role in forging documents. I suppose you could say the party favors were a bit unconventional this year. Handcuffs for some, closure for others. Not exactly what my mother had in mind when she picked out those blush pink napkins. 50 guests watched as the perfect family was led away in handcuffs. My mother's church friends, horrified. My father's former colleagues, stunned. The neighbors who had believed for 25 years that Theodore Ashford was the monster, suddenly realizing they had been wrong about everything. I stood by the rose bushes, watching it all unfold. Part of me expected to feel triumphant, victorious. Instead, I just felt tired. 32 years of lies will do that to you. Jace appeared at my side, his face a mixture of concern and calculation. I could practically see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how to play this situation to his advantage. He reached for my hand, started to say something about how sorry he was, how he had no idea things were this serious, how we should go somewhere and talk. I pulled my hand away and looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time. He was handsome, Jace Edwards, charming, the kind of man who always knew the right thing to say. But looking at him now, I saw someone else, someone who had sided with my family when I needed him most, someone who had called my search for truth an obsession, someone who had been more interested in my father's investment than in my well-being. I took off my engagement ring, 3 carats, princess cut, the ring Jace had spent months paying off because he wanted it to be perfect. I placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. He started to protest, to explain, to do what he always did when things weren't going his way. But I was already walking away, toward the front of the house where Theodore was waiting. Theodore had watched the whole thing from a distance, respecting my need to handle this myself. But when I reached him, when I finally let myself collapse against his shoulder, he held me like a father holds his child, like he had wanted to hold me for 25 years. The guests started leaving quietly, shell-shocked. A few of them stopped to speak to me. My aunt, my mother's sister, apologized for not seeing what was happening. A neighbor admitted they had always thought something was off about how I was treated. My mother's book club president said she was sorry, she just didn't know. They didn't know because they didn't want to know. They didn't know because it was easier to believe the story my parents told than to look beneath the surface. They didn't know because sometimes people would rather accept a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and accepted their apologies and watched them drive away from the wreckage of my family's reputation. Nadia found me an hour later after the police had left and the caterers had quietly packed up the uneaten anniversary cake. 32 years of marriage, and the celebration cake was going in the garbage. There was probably a metaphor in there somewhere. She was crying, really crying. the way I had never seen my carefree little sister cry before. She told me she had suspected, not the full truth, but pieces of it. She had noticed how differently our parents treated me. She had wondered why I looked nothing like the rest of the family. She had even found the trust fund documents once, years ago. But Constancia had caught her looking and made her swear never to mention them. Nadia had been 15, scared, dependent on our parents for everything. She had kept the secret, telling herself it wasn't her business, telling herself there must be an explanation. And then she had run away to Europe, as far as she could get, because staying in that house meant facing truths she wasn't ready to face. I wanted to be angry with her. Part of me was angry. But looking at my little sister, mascara streaking down her face, I saw someone who had also been damaged by our parents' lies. Not in the same way I had been, but damaged nonetheless. I told her we had a lot to talk about. I told her I wasn't ready to forgive her yet. But I also told her I wasn't ready to lose her completely. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually have a real sister. The house was empty now. The string lights still twinkled, absurdly festive against the backdrop of destruction. Theodore and I stood in the backyard looking at the home where I had grown up, the home that had never really been mine. He asked me if I was okay. Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. I told him I would be, eventually. But right now, I just wanted to go home. He looked confused for a moment. Home where? I smiled. The first real smile I had felt in months. Home, I told him. Across the street, where I should have been all along. We walked back to his house together, my father and I, the monster and his daughter. And for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't afraid of what I might find there. The legal process took 6 months. 6 months of depositions, hearings, evidence reviews, and more paperwork than I had ever seen in my accounting career. And believe me, I have seen a lot of paperwork. I once audited a restaurant that kept receipts in shoeboxes. This was worse. The criminal case went first. Jose pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperating with the investigation. His lawyer cited his age and health issues, painted him as a man who had simply followed his wife's lead for 32 years. The judge wasn't entirely convinced, but she accepted the plea. Jose received 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and complete forfeiture of his pension. Constancia did not plead guilty. Constancia fought every single charge with the kind of viciousness that made me realize I had never really known my mother at all. She hired expensive lawyers, filed motion after motion, tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter, manipulated by a predatory older man. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. Constancia Brennan was convicted on 12 counts of fraud, theft, and identity theft. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in state prison. I was there for the sentencing. I watched my mother's face as the judge pronounced the verdict. For one brief moment, I saw something I had never seen before. Regret. Real regret. Not for what she had done to me, but for getting caught. Then the moment passed, and her face hardened into familiar bitterness. She looked at me as the officers led her away, and her eyes promised that this wasn't over. But it was over. For her, at least. For me, it was just beginning. Wesley's case was handled separately. His lawyer argued that he had been coerced by his mother. The jury was more sympathetic to this argument than I would have liked. Wesley received 18 months in prison and 3 years probation. He also lost his business license and his reputation, which for Wesley was probably the worst punishment. The golden child finally tarnished. His wife Sandra filed for divorce before his sentencing. We had coffee once. Turns out we had a lot in common, both survivors of the Brennan family dysfunction. The civil case came next. Theodore's lawyers documented every dollar that had been stolen, every forged signature, every lie told to financial institutions. The judgment was $340,000, the original trust fund, plus interest, plus damages. My parents didn't have that kind of money in cash, of course. They had spent it all on Wesley's failed businesses, Nadia's European adventures, and their own comfortable retirement. But they did have the house on Maple Ridge Drive, the one they had secretly transferred to Wesley's name, trying to protect it from exactly this kind of judgment. The court found the transfer fraudulent. The house was seized, sold at auction. After legal fees and court costs, I received $280,000. It wasn't everything they had stolen, but it was enough. I used part of the money to pay off my student loans, the ones I had taken out because my parents said they couldn't afford to help while secretly draining my trust fund. I put some into an emergency fund and used the rest for a down payment on a house. A small house, nothing fancy, just 3 bedrooms and a nice yard, the house right next door to Theodore Ashford. My real estate agent thought I was crazy. Why would a young woman want to live next to an elderly professor in a quiet neighborhood? I didn't explain. Some things are too complicated for real estate transactions. I quit my job at the accounting firm. 8 years of fluorescent lights and dying coffee machines were enough. I started my own bookkeeping business, working with small businesses and independent contractors who needed someone to keep their finances straight. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My name on the door. My rules. My life. Theodore and I had dinner together every Sunday. He would cook his mother's recipes, the ones Eleanor had never gotten to teach me. I would bring dessert from the Italian bakery downtown. We talked about books, about history, about all the years we had missed. He showed me photos of my grandmother, a woman named Eleanor who had died when I was 5. She had known about me, Theodore said. She had wanted to meet me desperately, but Constantia had refused all contact. And Eleanor had died without ever holding her grandchild. I keep one of those photos on my nightstand now. Sometimes I talk to her, late at night when I can't sleep. I don't know if she can hear me, but it helps. Nadia and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. She moved back from Europe, started working as a translator for a nonprofit. She visits once a month. We don't talk about our parents much. There's too much pain there, still too raw. But we talk about other things, sister things, future things. She's the only Brennan I kept. Jace tried to contact me a few times. Texts, emails, even a handwritten letter I threw away without reading. Eventually, he got the message. Last I heard, he was engaged to someone else. Good luck to her. The neighbors think Theodore and I are quite the pair. The retired professor and the accountant, living side by side, having Sunday dinners on the porch. I overheard one of them wondering if we were some kind of eccentric intellectuals. Dangerous criminals, the both of us. Watch out for the woman with the spreadsheets and the man with the poetry books. We might audit your taxes and then discuss Whitman. The Brennan house sold 8 months after the auction. A young family bought it, a couple with 2 children and a golden retriever. I watched the moving trucks from Theodore's porch and felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but peace. One morning, about a year after the trial, I found Theodore sitting on his porch with a cardboard box. He looked different that day, older somehow, like he had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally ready to set it down. He asked me to sit with him. I did, settling into the chair that had become mine over the past months, the one with the faded cushion that Theodore kept meaning to replace but never did. I told him not to bother. That cushion had survived longer than my engagement to Jace, which meant it had earned its place. He said he had something for me, something he had been saving for 25 years. Inside the box were birthday cards, 25 of them, one for every year since he had moved across the street. Each card was still sealed in its envelope, my name written in Theodore's careful handwriting on the front. I opened them one by one. The card from my 7th birthday described watching me learn to ride a bicycle, how I had fallen 3 times, gotten back up each time, and finally pedaled to the end of the street with my arms raised in triumph. He had been celebrating silently from his window. The card from my 16th birthday mentioned a boy who had come to pick me up for what must have been my first date. Theodore had wanted to be the one standing on that porch, protecting his daughter, threatening the boy with vague but meaningful consequences. Instead, he had watched from behind his curtains. Every card was like that. 25 years of milestones observed from a distance. My graduation, my first car, my first apartment. He had documented all of it. He had loved me through all of it, even when I didn't know he existed as anything other than a monster. The card from my 30th birthday mentioned my engagement to Jace. Theodore had seen the ring when I visited my parents that Christmas. He had worried that something wasn't right. The Jace looked at me the way people look at investments rather than partners. He had wanted to say something but knew he couldn't. So he wrote it in a card I would never receive and hoped I would figure it out on my own. I did figure it out, eventually, just not soon enough. The last card was different. It wasn't sealed. It wasn't old. Theodore had written it just days before. It said, "I never stopped believing you would find your way home. And now that you're here, I want you to know something I've waited your whole life to tell you. I am proud of you, not for what you did to them, but for who you became despite them. You are strong and kind and brave. You are everything I hoped you would be. You are my daughter, and I love you." I cried reading that card, not the quiet tears I had trained myself to produce over years of family dinners, real tears, ugly tears, the kind that come when something inside you finally breaks open and heals at the same time. Theodore held my hand while I cried. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things are beyond words. When I finally stopped crying, I looked across the street at the house where I had grown up. The new family had painted the shutters blue. The children had left bicycles on the lawn. A tire swing hung from the old oak tree, something my parents had never allowed because it would have ruined the aesthetic. The house looked happy now, in a way it never had when I lived there. I thought about Constancia in her prison cell, probably writing letters I would never read. I thought about Jose doing community service somewhere, certainly complaining the whole time. I thought about Wesley rebuilding his reputation, probably already spinning stories about how he had been manipulated. They would move on eventually. They would find ways to justify what they had done, to convince themselves they were the real victims. People like them always did, but I was done thinking about them. I had spent 32 years in their orbit, defining myself by their approval, measuring my worth by their attention. Now I had something better. Not alone anymore. Never alone again.